Today, I want to talk about Arcane Blade and how I beat insane roguelike difficulty with it. In the first part of the video, I'll go over all the Arcane Blade talents, and in the second one, I'll show you the character that I beat the game with and go more in depth about leveling, prodigies, gear, and so on. Arcane Blade is one of the 7 default classes in the game, but out of those, it's definitely the most complex. If you are a beginner, trying to figure this class out will be a headache. For starters, you'll notice it has 3 base stats, potentially 4 if you dual wield. Arcane Blade uses both stamina and mana, which are simple resources, but what I want to start mentioning here is fatigue, which affects different resources differently. This is an important factor for deciding what kind of armor you want to wear. In Arcane Blade's case, you can see mana has double fatigue penalties, so this is a disincentive against heavy armor. You can lower your fatigue with certain gear and talents, and some classes can deal with higher talent costs better than others, but this is still always important information to know. As a side note, since googling information is a key part of playing Tome, you can usually just type TE4 plus fatigue, for example. You don't have to type out the whole name. Anyways, let's talk about the talents, starting with Maj'Eyal Combat, as this is what Arcane Blade is all about. Arcane Combat is a sustain that gives your melee attacks a percentage chance to cast a spell on the target as a free action, and this does not put the spell on cooldown. The only spells that you can cast this way though are Flame, Lightning and Earthen Missiles. You pick one of these and build the whole character around it. If you're looking for a glass cannon type class, this one is it. Few defensive options, but man, when Arcane Blade gets going, you'll be blowing up everything on the screen and it's a lot of fun. But it takes a bit of leveling up before this becomes a viable way to play. Early on, which for my character meant more or less until the first Prodigy, you'll simply be using your spells at range, playing like an Archmage. Other than the damage spell, you also have to make the choice between a two-handed weapon, dual wielding or one-handed weapon plus shield, each with its own tree. The penalty you see for dual wielding and shields is because you get more hits in with those than a two-hander, so you get more chances to proc the spell for free, so it roughly evens out. Kind of. I'll talk more about the weapon choice later. Before we get any further into the talents, I want to talk about an obscure mechanic with Arcane Combat. This is information I learned reading through the forums after already beating the game on this class while completely ignoring this mechanic, so it's absolutely not crucial, but I have to mention it. So bear with me here. As you probably know, weapon types in Tome have different bonuses for excess accuracy, simply meaning how much higher your accuracy is than the enemy's defense. Usually it's stuff like weapon damage or crit multi, but staves have a plus 2% proc damage as their accuracy bonus, which logically affects things like plus 15 fire damage on melee hits, which you'll frequently find on weapons. That makes sense, right? Well, it also apparently affects all other damage that happens in the same instant as the melee hit. What this means is that Lightning and Flame, proccing from Arcane Combat, get affected by this accuracy bonus because they are both an instantly hitting beam, whereas Earthen Missiles doesn't, because it's a projectile, which always has some travel time, I guess, even if the target is right next to you. Long story short, stacking accuracy is actually an incredibly potent damage boost if you go Lightning or Flame. If you dual wield, one-handed staves only have a plus 1% proc damage increase, making it half as good, but still worth it. So that's how that works. Let's finish this talent tree, and then I'll talk more about each of the 3 archetypes. Arcane Cunning is a passive that gives you spell power based on your cunning. Doesn't scale with points too well, but it's still good, because despite hitting things with your weapon, spells will be your main damage source. Arcane Feat is a sustain that gives you mana regen and crit chance for both attacks and spells. This is basically an inscription slot, as it lets you replace the mana search rune, which you would otherwise need to regenerate your mana, and the crit chance doesn't hurt either. Arcane Destruction is another passive, which increases your physical power based on your magic and does a bit of extra arcane damage in a small AoE each time you crit. Physical power is not too important of a stat for Arcane Blade. It helps with stunning enemies, which each weapon style gets, but you very likely won't care about weapon damage at all. Still, it's worth at least a point for the arcane damage procs. So now, about the 3 routes you have for your character. Let's start with Fire. Flame is the first candidate for Arcane Combat, and it becomes a beam at level 5. But the huge downside is that it deals its damage over 3 turns. You can see that the damage is pretty similar to the other spells, but the other 2 just happen instantly. Flame Shock is a massive AoE stun, which is great. The one unfortunate part is that if the enemy resists the stun, it won't take any damage from this, as it's all part of the same debuff, but you don't really need it for the damage anyways. Fire Flash is a big AoE doing instant damage, finally. Not much to say other than it's pretty good. Inferno is then one of the few spells Arcane Blade should in theory pull off better than Archmage, since you'll eventually always be in radius 5, but the problem is, if you go in melee range as Arcane Blade, the fight will be over very quickly, one way or the other, so this is just fine at best. Okay, so Flame doesn't sound the best, so what about Earthen Missiles? Well, the good news is that you get 2 whole class trees that focus on physical damage. Bad news is, the one with Earthen Missiles is locked, so you'll need to use a whole category point on it. Let's talk about the unlocked one first, Earth. Pulverizing Auger is a range 10, 3 cooldown physical beam, so already very good, and on top of that, it can also dig into walls, which then increases your physical damage. This might be the best basic beam spell in the game. Even if you don't focus on physical damage, digging through walls can be life-saving in niche situations, so it's worth considering putting 1 or 2 points here and experimenting with it. Stone Skin is a sustain that gives you a bit of armor and also sometimes reduces a cooldown. This is nice if you're going to have high armor hardiness, so probably wearing heavy armor. I think it's a lot simpler to just go light armor and focus on defense instead on Arcane Blade though, just so you don't need to worry about fatigue, and because robes have some really good spell modifiers, or egos as Tom calls them. Mudslide is an AoE knockback, which is a bit counterproductive, as you eventually want to stand next to enemies, but it's decent for the Archmage part of the run. Stone Wall simply entombs you in a wall, which is surprisingly incredibly powerful. It basically buys you 10 plus turns of safety, letting you heal up and get your powerful talents back. Or sometimes you can use it on a scary unique and deal with the rest of the enemies. This is another huge reason to invest here, even if you're not doing physical damage. You can also combo it with Pulverizing Auger, so you can always leave the wall, you're never stuck inside. Then we have the locked category, Stone. Earthen Missiles are the second candidate for Arcane Combat. I think the idea is that it should have the highest single target damage, and it does, on paper, but the accuracy stacking I spoke about more than makes up for it, and even if it didn't, the beam just works so much better than the projectiles, often hitting and one-shotting multiple enemies. But wait a second, this does physical damage, and your weapon also does physical damage, right? So maybe that's the niche for Earthen Missiles. You kind of double dip, doing good damage with both the weapon and your spell. Well, unfortunately, while this is a cool idea and I really wanted to make it work, the more I thought about it, the more I realized it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I imagined going strength and a two-handed weapon, but when you look at the two-handed egos, so few of them help with the spells. They only give physical crit, and there's just this single increased physical damage, and at that point it just feels like, why are you even playing Arcane Blade? Just play something like Berserker. But then I thought, wait a second, what if you go Staff Combat? So you get all the good egos and still do some decent damage with your weapon. And this does make a lot more sense, but at that point you're back to basically building the character more or less in the same way as the other two archetypes, and then the question goes back to, why are you not using a beam? Body of Stone makes you unable to move, but gives you decent elemental and stun resists. I don't think this is very good, for Arcane Blade at least. You don't care about the cooldowns much, since you'll mostly be proccing your spells by attacking, and the stun resistance is irrelevant, since you can't afford to just be running around with 35% stun resist. Earthquake is a big, long-lasting AoE that deals damage and stuns everything every turn. Powerful, but be aware that this includes yourself, so not the easiest to use once you start going melee. Crystalline Focus is your big reward for going physical, passively increasing damage and giving huge physical penetration. This is the one talent you'll be jealous of if you don't go physical. So this archetype, I think, is at least interesting, but now we get to air. Lightning is the third and final candidate for Arcane Combat, and it's just a range 10 3-turn cooldown beam. It also objectively sounds the best out of all the elements when you're proccing it 4 times in a single attack. Chain Lightning is the big AoE nuke, like all the other archetypes had, but this one is even better than it looks at first glance, since it damages all creatures between each target, so in cramped rooms this can do amazing single target damage too. Just be a little careful, since it can jump up to 10 tiles away, it can sometimes pull enemies you don't want to. Featherwind is a sustain that gives you up to 100% pin and 55% stun immunity, which is really nice, and it also gives a few other less important stats. You usually don't have the luxury of being immune to pin, but it feels pretty good. This is a fine sustain. Thunderstorm is similar to Inferno. It's consistent damage over time, which, as I mentioned, is not the best, but I like this one a lot better because it's a sustain, so you never have to waste a turn casting it, and it also sort of reveals invisible enemies, since they will get hit by this even in stealth. This will even stop your auto-exploring when it happens, so it's actually alright. In conclusion, Lightning is the most popular and simply strongest option. I especially recommend it if you don't exactly know what you are doing yet. It's also how I built my character, so you can hear more about it in the build guide section. You shouldn't be too discouraged if you really like the idea of a physical or fire arcane blade. I'm sure you can make it work, as this is just a very powerful class, but be aware that you are taking on an additional challenge. And now, let's go in order. There are a lot of categories to cover, but they're often not that relevant, so I'll be brief. Combat techniques, but only at 1.0 mastery. If you've played Tome for even a little bit, you'll know this tree quite well, as a lot of classes have access to it. Rush is simply a great mobility talent. Gets better range with points, which is very useful, but usually a low priority. Precise strikes are almost always just a 1-pointer, so you can get to the rest of the talents. You would need to be really desperate for the crit chance to invest more here. For Perfect Strike, you usually want 1, maybe 2 points to deal with some uniques with high defense and stealth things, but because of the accuracy stacking, if you don't use earthen missiles and use staves, you want to invest probably 4 points here for the duration and just use it every fight. Blinding Speed is ultimately why I invest into this tree whenever I can. Acting more often is just good, and on Arcane Blade, the fight will be definitely over in 5 turns. Next, Dirty Fighting, the category. Dirty Fighting, the talent, makes an unarmed attack, which debuffs your target if it hits, reducing their immunities to stun, blind, pin and confusion to 50% of the normal value. This can be useful against some tough enemies, and it's important because of Backstab, which increases your damage against targets for each disabling effect up to 30% at 3 effects and max rank. This works on your spells too, by the way. Backstab also gives you a small chance to inflict new disables on enemies, so it kind of fuels itself. I really like this in theory. It helps you out against bosses, right? But unfortunately, the fight is almost always over before this has a chance to get going, making it fairly useless. Blinding Powder blinds in a tiny cone and reduces enemy accuracy. Once you're this close to enemies, you probably don't want to waste your turns not hitting and not proccing Arcane Combat. Twist the Knife hits the enemy, but only once, and increases the duration of negative effects and reduces the duration of positive ones. Same story as for the rest of this tree, this doesn't really synergize too well with Arcane Blade. Enhancement is the second unique Arcane Blade tree. Arcane Strike hits twice, dealing some irrelevant arcane damage, but gaining you a bunch of mana. This is a great filler attack. The mana gain can be very relevant early game, and it's always 2 hits, so it's strictly better than just a basic attack. You're unlikely to be putting a lot of points here though. Fiery Hands is a sustain that makes your fire damage a bit better. If you're focusing on it, you'll probably eventually max this out. If not, this is a 1-pointer, and for the Archmage portion of the game, it's not even worth the 40 mana to turn it on. Shock Hands is basically the lightning version of Fire Hands. But now we get to Inner Power, which is a passive that boosts your strength, dex, magic and cunning, and it even gives you a decent shield before you take damage. This is what actually lets you comfortably play this class. Before you get to this talent, it's a bit of a nightmare trying to balance putting points into categories requiring all these different stats. You should definitely max this quickly. Then we get to the locked categories, where you'll have to decide about the weapons you'll be using. But first, let's talk about the trees not concerning weapons. Combat Veteran is quite likely the worst talent category in the entire game. Numbers on the talents are just way too low to be worth investing into. Superiority is a bit more of an option, and that's mainly because of Juggernaut, which gives you physical damage reduction and crit shag-off for 20 turns at instant speed. It does what it's trying to do well, and since you'll be spending time in melee, this is tempting. Unfortunately, the rest of these talents don't really maintain the same level of quality. Onslaught gives you knockback on your melee attacks, so you are basically sabotaging yourself. Not great. Battle Call pulls enemies in a large area into your melee range. This is a talent you should know, because the AI has probably already killed you a bunch of times with this, pulling you into really deadly rooms. Arcane Blades, Berserkers and Bulwarks can have access to this, so when you see a unique with those classes, always be careful. As for the player, this is okay. It takes a whole turn to cast and you can't pick the targets, so if there's an Archmage sitting behind some rogue Berserkers, do you really want to Battle Call? You'll usually have better options for closing the gap, like Rush, or you can simply cast your magic manually at range, or just wait around the corner and let the enemies come to you. Shattering Impact is a sustain that makes you deal a bit of extra physical damage in radius 1 when you attack, but it doesn't even deal damage to the primary target. This is just awful. You'll have better AoE talents on every single class. We are left with 3 more locked trees for the weapons, and instead of going over the talents, let's have a look at the spreadsheet, because really the only thing that matters is how many times you can attack with a talent, not what it actually does. I'm using 80% as the base Arcane Combat chance, because that is roughly what you should get to in the late game. I managed to get to 82% on my character. Then you can always see the category, name of the talents, and how many times they hit, and what are the odds of getting at least a single proc from that talent. The important information you should take from this is that it's difficult to beat the consistency of the two-handed assault. Even though most of these talents don't actually help you as they only hit once, you simply get the highest odds of getting a proc. But the best talent for Arcane Combat is not actually from the two-handed assault, it is Flurry in Dual Techniques, which hits 6 times at a 40% chance, so it only gets a 95% chance of getting at least 1 proc, but if you look at the odds through this cumulative binomial distribution function, you'll find out that you actually have higher odds of getting 2 or more procs than if you only hit 2 times at 80%. So Flurry is the best talent for Arcane Combat, and this makes Dual Techniques a potentially viable option, because if you get 2, 3, even 4 procs, things will die. You don't really need any other talents, because nothing will survive that. So these two, Two-Handed Assault and Dual Techniques, I see them as the clear favorites. Shield Offense, I doubt it's awful, but it just doesn't really seem... I don't see a good reason to go into Shield Offense over the consistency of two-handed assault or the high roll potential and fun of having Flurry. Moving on to the general talents, we have the very common Survival. So, briefly, Heightened Senses is just a one-pointer to get to the other talents, as it doesn't really do anything. Device Mastery is a passive that lets you use active items more often, which can be very powerful if you've got some good ones, so this is entirely dependent on your gear. Track lets you spot enemies through walls, which will probably save your life more than any other defensive talent. 1 point is usually enough, more feels nice, but it's a very low priority. And the Danger Sense passively reduces the bonus damage of critical strikes against you. Worth a point for that, more are again a very low priority. Then Arcane Blades get Conveyance, which is an excellent 3, but only at 1.0 mastery. Face Door is a 10 range teleport. Unfortunately, you'll have to spend 5 points in it before it really becomes usable, but it's definitely worth it. This is a great escape talent, but just don't use it to get close to enemies, save it for escaping. Teleport also teleports you, but this time the range is 100 plus tiles. You can use this talent in 3 ways. The first way, you put a single point here and you use this as a last resort. When you run out of all other options, you simply close your eyes, press teleport and hope it moved you somewhere safe, away from the unique that was about to kill you. This is mostly useful in the early game. If you put 4 points here, you can instead target the unique and hope it got teleported far enough that you can stabilize. Or if you put 5 points here, you can finally choose the target area where you want to teleport something. The downside is that it's a radius 12 area, so it's still not actually that reliable, especially in levels with a lot of walls, which is the vast majority of them. Displacement Shield lets you shield yourself, and damage that hits the shield will also damage a designated target. This lasts for a ridiculous amount of time, but if the target dies, the shield disappears. Fortunately, this is easily prevented by just targeting the scariest enemy. This talent is good by itself, and Arcane Blade gets another talent that boosts all damage shields, so this can get really big. Probability Travel is a sustain that costs 100 mana, and it lets you warp through terrain. This is fun, and could in theory be very situationally useful, but I don't think 100 mana is worth that. Aegis is the last general category, and it's very important as it gives some much needed survivability. Arcane Reconstruction heals you. This is useful in the early game especially, but I rarely put more than a single point here. Shielding is the sustain that I mentioned, making all your damage shields stronger. Powerful, and a reason to change up your inscription setup a little bit. I ran a damage shield rune over a healing infusion, for example. Arcane Shield is a sustain that gives you a damage shield based on how much you heal. This has some synergy, I guess, with Arcane Reconstruction, but ideally your HP should never get lowered. Your shields should tank everything, at least late game. And you don't really have many great ways to heal, other than Arcane Reconstruction. I don't think this sustain makes a lot of sense on Arcane Blade. And finally, Aegis is an instant speed spell that just makes all your shields stronger. Nice. Notably, Disruption Shield is a different talent than Displacement Shield, so the extra text does not apply to Arcane Blade. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss. As always, these are the add-ons that I used. None of them affect gameplay, they're mostly UI based, but you can look through them. Talking about the stats, the first time you play Arcane Blade and you look through the categories, it's really intimidating, because you need dexterity if you go dual wielding, then you need strength, you need cunning for deadly fighting, for example, or survival, and then you need magic for any of the spells that you pick. So it's a little overwhelming trying to figure out, well, what do I actually do, where do I put the points? All you need to know is that Inner Power solves all your problems, and thankfully you need magic for Inner Power, and to actually clear the early game, you also need these spells, which all require magic, so you just pump magic. Once you get to inner power, you max inner power as soon as possible, and this will solve all of your problems, letting you pick any talent you want. For the second stat, you just want to go Cunning, as it's a great damage multiplier. You want to one-shot as many enemies as possible within the first couple of turns each fight. And in general, on Arcane Blade, you want to get your Cunning as high as you possibly can, because it increases your Arcane Combat percentage. So from any escort that you can get +5 Cunning, you should probably just take the +5 Cunning. Any items that have a big Cunning bonus should be much more attractive than usual. I think aiming at around 80% is reasonable and should make your character feel pretty good. Then for the third stat, I just went into Dexterity for mainly the defense and crit shrug off, and some accuracy, which I just didn't know increases the damage, but obviously now knowing that, accuracy makes a lot of sense as your third stat, at least if you go dual wielding. And then I put just some points into Constitution for some extra life, since willpower doesn't really give me anything and neither does strength. For my race I went with Drem, which is from the Forbidden Cults DLC, which I really hope you have, because, well, first of all, I think it's the best DLC, but I think this is one of the coolest races in the game, and that's all because of Frenzy, which lets you use your class talents twice, which just changes up a lot of classes, opens up possibilities that are just not usually available. It makes me just want to play Drem on almost every class. On Arcane Blade especially, with dual wielding, just double casting Flurry is just, that's all you need. If you only had Frenzy on Drem, I would still pick it, because it's just that powerful. Other than Frenzy, you also get Spike Skin, which just increases your all resists when you get hit in melee, which I didn't really find much need for. You get Faceless, which gives you a lot of confusion immunity, so this is nice. And then you get From Below It Devours, which is kind of a crowd control tool. I basically never put points into this talent, because I just don't find a need for it. On Arcane Blade especially, you just don't need this effect, but even on ranged classes, there are usually other talents that I'd rather use. But at the same time, I think it's better than what I give it credit for, so try it out. You can just put a point here, test it out, maybe you'll find it more useful than I do, and if not, you can just take it away and keep it at 0. If you can't or don't want to go Drem, I think any of the other classes will do. Ogre is interesting, as you can use the two-handed staff plus an offhand and still go dual techniques. Or then you just have the boring options like Shalor, which is basically always good. You could even go Kornak, even though you don't really have a use for the extra category points. Halflings could also be decent just to pump your crit chance really high. In terms of leveling, it's actually very simple, as you simply just max out all your Archmage talents. So you start out with Lightning, that will carry you through the early game, and eventually you'll be using it for Arcane Combat, so definitely worth 5 points. Then you max out Chain Lightning, because it's just a very powerful spell. Then you get to Inner Power finally, which gives you a decent amount of survivability because of the shield, and all these different stats that you need. And then you can start slowly filling out the melee part of your character. So the question becomes, when do you swap into melee? And the answer will differ based on the difficulty you play. Obviously, if you play Nightmare or lower, you will be able to get away with it earlier. But on Insane, it was really difficult to actually stay in melee range, because I was dying really quickly. So I just basically decided to not even attempt it before getting to my first Prodigy. Lightning and Chain Lightning will be more than good enough to just carry you all the way up until level 25. When enemies do close the gap, you will have talents like Dual Strike that can help you stun enemies and get a few procs, but for the most part you should try to keep your distance and just shoot lightning on cooldown. Once you get to level 25, you have a big choice ahead of you. You will see a lot of guides mentioned that Flexible Combat is an incredibly powerful Prodigy for Arcane Blade, and it's kind of a mandatory pick. I think there could be an argument made that if you go two-handed and you don't hit as often, Flexible Combat is not as good, But for dual wielding, I do think that flexible combat is definitely your best option, because all these unarmed attacks can also trigger Arcane Combat, so it's just really synergistic and powerful. But this is not actually the Prodigy that I picked on level 25, because I wasn't really struggling with damage, I was struggling with survivability. So this is why I went for Ethereal form on level 25. This is one of my favorite Prodigies. It just feels so good to take, it's immediately impactful, and it gives you mainly basically defense, literally, right? It gives you a lot of defense. Basically just by itself, you don't need it on gear or anywhere else, it will make a lot of enemies just miss you. But then it gives you all damage penetration, so that kind of helps you with gearing a little bit, and absolute damage resistance, which is not all resistance, it applies after all the damage calculations, it just reduces the damage by 25%. At least I think that's how it works, that's what it says on the tooltip here. The downside of these bonuses getting reduced when you get hit is basically just not a downside, because you won't be getting hit. So once you pick up Ethereal form on level 25, that's when you start going melee. And it really should be just immediately noticeable how much easier it is to stay in melee combat and just not get one shot. Then you just slowly fill out the rest of your talents. You want to aim for getting Blinding Speed maxed out. Obviously Arcane Combat should be maxed out to get the highest odds possible of triggering your lightning. Now the leveling template will be quite different from my actual tree, because I made quite a lot of mistakes. For example, the dirty fighting, as I talked about in the overview, ultimately this is just mostly useless, because enemies will just die before this has a lot of chance to take effect. Sure, you hit 6 times, and I have a lot of disabling effects on my weapons. I have this 20% chance to stun, blind, pin, confuse or silence on my dagger, and a bunch of other effects on the rest of my gear. So it stacks up quickly, but enemies will just die. So you don't need this. Instead, I obviously should have put it into Perfect Strike, now that I know that the accuracy stacking exists. And then, I think going Pulverizing Auger and Stonewall should just be a lot more valuable than the little extra damage you get from Backstab. Whatever weapon style you decide to pick, you shouldn't put too many points into these talents, because really, again, all you need from them is to just hit a lot. I put 2 points to Dual Strike because this increases the stun duration. The downside is that I only have 82 physical power, which is decent, but some of the toughest enemies will have around this same amount of physical saves, so that's why I only put 2 points here, because it's not reliable. Only 1 point into Flurry. You don't need the weapon damage increased. And Heartseeker is a very nice ability because of the mobility that it provides. You could even put more points here for more range, but 3 is usually enough. This is usually used once you rush in, or even use your movement infusion to jump in the middle of enemies. You will use this to maybe switch targets once you one-shot one unique and the other rare is just standing 2-3 tiles away from you. That's where you'll be using Heartseeker to just continue pumping out damage. Whirlwind is very similar, but it just has a shorter range. Still, though, I definitely should have put a point here, just to have it as an additional option. For the generic points, I maxed out Thick Skin, as always, a single point into Heavy Training, so that I could wear Heavy Mail, Armor, Gauntlets, Helms and Heavy Boots, 3 points in Light Armor Training, even though you should be able to get away with a single point. If you have more heavy items that give you increased fatigue, this can help you keep it at 0. Combat accuracy, I should have maxed this, but I didn't know about the accuracy stacking. In survival, I maxed out Danger Sense. I did this on all my early characters. I just kind of had an obsession with not getting a one-shot from stealth. That's what I was really afraid of, but it's definitely not needed. If I instead put these points into shielding or Aegis, it would have given me more survivability. Even though, if you look right now, if I activate my shield and I Aegis it, it's giving me a 2300 shield, which is pretty good. It only lasts 6 turns, but yeah, you don't need more than that. Then I had a category point left over, since you only need to unlock dual techniques, and I decided to go for Harmony, because why not, right? What else am I going to do with the point? You could go Superiority just for Juggernaut if you really want to. You could just put the point into Magical Combat to increase it to 1.5 Mastery. But I checked this out, this increased this by like 1%. Oh, it's not really worth it. And Harmony, it's just alright. The best talent I think is Waters of Life, which just lets you ignore poisons. The heal is mostly irrelevant, since you don't have willpower, it will always be really small. But letting you just ignore poison is quite nice against certain types of enemies. Elemental Harmony is the second talent, which feels nice to have. It feels like it should do a decent amount when you look at it and all these bonus stats that it gives you, but I don't think it's actually too good, since you can't rely on any of these bonuses, right? You don't know what the enemy will hit you with, so sure, sometimes you get some life regen, sometimes you get some armor. The global speed from fire damage is probably the best out of all these, but you basically won't ever notice this having an effect. One with nature can be decent, removing the infusion saturation, so you can use your infusions more. Sure, again, I didn't really ever need this, but it's there. And then healing Nexus, I don't think this is really worth a single point. You just don't want to be wasting a turn casting this, ever. You'd rather just auto-attack. If you find a different category from an Escort, for example, feel free to take it. You won't be missing Harmony at all. But it's a decent filler. And it's really lazy, because you don't need to go out of your way to pick an Escort category. You just get this after eating the Sandworm Queen's Heart. Once you get to level 42, you will pick up Flexible Combat, and this will just skyrocket your damage. It will already be really good, but after Flexible Combat, you just reach ungodly amounts of damage, and this is the class that really made me realize just how powerful damage is as a defensive option, basically. If you can kill everything in just a couple of turns, yeah, they don't have time to deal damage to you, so I think this is a good class if you are like me, and you tend to build characters really defensively. Try Arcane Blade, because you can't really build this class defensively. You have to focus on offense, so it will get you out of your comfort zone, and it should help you become a better player overall. There's one more Prodigy I want to mention, and that is the Arcane Amplification drone, which is an instant speed ability that you put down, and that all damage you put into it explodes as 130% of arcane damage in a 4 radius. I've never actually tried this Prodigy myself, but I've read on forums that it's supposed to be incredibly powerful with Arcane Blade. The idea being, you just, when you come to an enemy, you set this up behind them, then you hit them with your flurry, and 100 lightning bolts explode out of you, deal 1,000,000 damage, then they hit the Arcane Amplification drone, doing 1,000,000 damage again, this time as arcane damage, and it feels a little overkill, because damage is just not something you really need, but I think it's an interesting choice. If you are feeling brave, maybe don't take Ethereal form and go for Flexible Combat into Arcane Amplification drone, you will deal a lot of damage, which is not needed, but you will do a lot of damage. For my infusions, I managed to be immune to Confusion, Silence and Stun, so I ran still a Wild Infusion for physical effects, as these are the most common, and I'm still not immune to Blind, so Physical Wild is always useful. But then I ran a Magical Wild instead of a Mental Wild, because I don't need it for Silence, and I don't need it for Confusion, and this one was just really good. I'll sometimes just use it for the damage reduction. 46% damage reduction for 4 turns can just be used at the beginning of a fight to make yourself a lot tankier. You don't need to save it for an actual negative effect. I also ran a Shatter Afflictions as just a nice catch-all cleanse. Then I used a Rune Reflection Shield, which scales with your magic always, and if it drops, this will be a huge shield that also deals some damage back. And here I of course ran a Movement Infusion for the entire game. I couldn't play without it. But just for the final boss I swapped it for a Rune of Dissipation, just to strip Elandar of his really powerful sustains, and because I knew that I'm not going to need the Movement Infusion. Let's look at my items, and you'll notice that I finally started prioritizing crit multi and crit chance and offensive stats over just purely defensive stats. Also, all kinds of these on-hit effects are really powerful, since obviously you'll be hitting 12 times in the first 2 actions. You'll be able to apply most of these on-hit effects you have on your gear. That being said, this hat is actually really awful, as I'm pretty sure I have these on-hit effects on other parts of my gear, so all this does is give me 80 more life, and these stats. Fizz crit I don't care about, damage mod light obviously also useless, so this item basically doesn't exist. Then I use the Vox as my amulet, which is tier 5 unique, so you might not be able to find it, but it's quite nice as it gives you 100% silence immunity, so you don't have to worry about it, and it gives some spell crit, very little, and a bit of spell power. Very likely not the ideal amulet, but these items that give you 100% immunity, they just feel really good to equip, as they just take care of one of your weaknesses and you don't have to juggle your pieces of gear where you put one ring away that has a 50% silence immunity, and then you need to put 2 more pieces of gear that have a 25% immunity that you've been saving for 20 levels. I hate that kind of inventory management, so I really tend to gravitate towards these just 100% immunity, you're set, you don't need to worry about it. I really like those. My cloak has a lot of numbers, even though most of them don't do anything. These Stormbringer gauntlets though, these are important to mention, as I think this should be the best in slot item for lightning Arcane Blade. You get 20% chain lightning on your unarmed hits, so this means flexible combat triggers, and then you get just lightning on spell hits, and you have many ways of triggering that, and on top of that it just gives you a +1 to all lightning damage spells, and gives some crit multi and spell crit and damage mod for lightning. Just everything this item gives, you want, and these gloves are quite common, so you should be able to find them. Then I wore a Girdle of Preservation, just to shore up my resistances a little bit, and just because I couldn't find a decent belt. My boots are completely useless. If you look through these stats, none of them actually matter. I mean, okay, it gives some cunning and it gives some dex, so that's decent, but in terms of the modifiers, none of them do anything. The melee 20% chance I have on my other pieces of gear, so far I have 2 items that are basically just don't exist. For my tool, I have a powerful psionic shield as per usual, some crit multi on my lantern, while also giving me some stun immunity and a lot of light. My rings were quite good, combining some life and immunity with a lot of stats and getting some crit multi on top of that. For my ropes, I used the Worm Nest, which looks really cool. Look at my guy. Worms climbing all over his body, I mean, that's just an awesome look. Fortunately, the item itself is quite bad for my build. It gives me 8 spell crit, 15 magic, a little spell power. The damage mod is useless, I don't do blight damage. The move speed bonus is useless, as I just have a movement infusion if I need to run away. And then it gives 22 flat reduction, which is nice. I love flat reduction in Tome, but yeah, you can definitely find a much better rope. But you definitely can't beat the look of the Worm Nest, so it's kind of a balancing act between looking good and having good stats. And on these classes like Arcane Blade, where you're just ridiculously, stupidly powerful in the late game, you can get away with fashion over power. My dagger is pretty nasty, as it has 3 on-hit effects, all of them very useful, all of them doing lightning damage or a bunch of disables. This is a big reason for when I hit an enemy, there are just a million other lightnings just all over the place triggering constantly. So this dagger I think is really powerful and really good. And then on my staff I just have a really fat crit multi, and yeah, I mean that's pretty much it. So that's what you can get away with on Arcane Blade. In terms of quality of life for a single hotbar, it's perfectly fine. A lot of these talents I just very rarely used, and they're here just to fill up the hotbar and make it look colorful. Still, I had to push some of these sustains on my second bar, but it's never a problem if you remember to autocast all your sustains when out of combat. So when some enemy strips you of your sustains, they will just automatically turn on after the combat ends. With some sustains, this is easy to see when they stop working because they have a visual effect, but a lot of them don't, so this is just a good way to make sure they never stop working. In terms of the escorts, I mentioned you want cunning whenever you can. If an option is +5 cunning, you should always take +5 cunning. If you can't take cunning, then just take magic. Other than that, I was lucky to find a Sun Paladin, so I took a Chant of Fortress. I also took Premonition, which is kind of a no-brainer on classes that have high spell power and already use mana. Premonition is just very good, giving you some additional damage reduction. It costs 120 mana to sustain, but this shouldn't be a problem for you in the late game. For the Alchemist rewards, it's the usual class points, then generic points, then spell crit, then +5 cunning, then +5 magic, and then the rest doesn't matter much. What's maybe not as known is that if you give an alchemist their last ingredient, they will give you a special item. And each alchemist gives a different item. You can look this up on the wiki, but the best item out of these is the Elixir of Invulnerability, which just makes you invulnerable for 5 turns, which is really overpowered. And I saved this up all the way for the final boss, and I never really had to use it. But if you can, once you get all the important elixirs out of the way, this is something to aim for. Obviously you won't be able to get this every game, because the order in which the alchemists complete their elixirs is random, but if you can manage to get the Elixir of Invulnerability, it's really good. In conclusion, Arcane Blade is a very powerful class with one of the highest late game damage potentials in the entire game. The only obstacle you have to overcome is leveling as an Archmage with limited options, but this is still pretty comfortable. If you want to understand why the best defense is a good offense, or you just simply want to enjoy two-shotting bosses, this is the class for you. Next time, I'll be talking about a class that is even stronger than Paradox Mage. Thank you for watching.